Let me just check if it's working, and then we can start. Let me just check. Yeah, it is working. So it's now live. Now, welcome to Symposiac's vodcast. This is a ministry of Symposia Covenant Church, and it's co-hosted by Laurence Gonzaga. He's a friend of mine who's a Roman Catholic. Okay, so he's not a Covenanter, right? So he's a Roman Catholic, and he gives us different perspective here. We come from a different perspective. I think I can probably classify Laurence as some kind of a conservative Christian or conservative Catholic. I don't think he's a right-wing Catholic or a far right-wing Catholic. I don't think that, right? So I think he's a conservative Catholic, and I am much more. I'm a Protestant, but theologically moderate. I probably see myself as a left-leaning moderate when it comes to theology, but I also not on the far left, right? So probably this is a good combination, right? Someone who's a conservative Catholic and a theologically moderate Protestant discussing theological issues. Now, so for today, we're going to look at Bart Ehrman. And probably many of you are familiar with Bart Ehrman. For those of you who like to study New Testament and you like scholarly work on New Testament, and also popular work on New Testament, you must have heard of Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman was a former evangelical. He's now, I think, some kind of an agnostic. If he's not an atheist, I think before he claimed to be an atheist, but now I think he seems to consider himself more as an agnostic. But he's a New Testament scholar at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. What else can we say about him? I think he got his bachelor's degree from some kind of an evangelical college, and then he received his. It's probably Wheaton College, right? One of the most well known evangelical college in the world, and then he got his a master's degree from Princeton. I should have checked the details of his education before we started. But yeah, I know he got his MDiv, I think, from Princeton Theological Seminary, and he got his Ph.D. From Princeton Theological Seminary as well. Ph.D. in New Testament Studies. He actually worked under what's his name? One of the greatest American New Testament scholar. Now I can't remember his name. I should have checked it. But yeah, if I remember his name as we are having our discussion here, I'll mention it. Okay, but you know what? I probably will not be. I will not. Let me check it, right? So I just wanted to make sure, because if I don't, I'll keep on thinking about it. So I might as well check it out. Okay. He was actually a student of. Let me see. Sorry if I'm doing it right now. So as you can see, we're live. Okay. So he was he's a well-known New Testament scholar. For whatever reason, I forgot his name. But I'll mention it here. Bruce Metzger. There you go. Right. Bruce Metzger. I think he's one of the main people who part of the NRSV, the translation. Okay. He's actually a well-known New Testament scholar, Bruce Metzger from Princeton Theological Seminary. Laurence, you wanted to say something before we start talking about Bart Ehrman's view on the historicity, or the lack of historicity, or the lack of, or he's going to go against the historicity, right, of crucifixion and resurrection. But before we discuss that, do you want to say something, Laurence?
Well, I just wanted to say I'm somewhat familiar with his work. I've seen some of his debates. He's debated James White, who's a sort of well-known Reformed, Reformed Reformed Baptist, I think is his denomination. He's an apologist. He also worked on I believe it was the NRSV or NASB translation. So he's sort of a biblical scholar in his own right, but they obviously debated the historicity of the scriptures. And I think I've seen parts of his debate with William Lane Craig. Also he recently debated a Catholic apologist, Jimmy Akin, about 3 weeks ago. For Jimmy Akin being a Catholic apologist from Catholic Answers, written several books on various topics. But so I'm loosely familiar with his work and his position. I have some of his books, and I've read maybe some of the chapters, but I haven't, invested a lot of time reading, his entire works, because I obviously am not in his camp, and so it's. You only have so much time to read the works that you want to read, and if it's from a worldview that you're not in line with, it's kind of, I wouldn't say it's a waste of time, but it's certainly not the best use of my time. So I'll just say that, and then we can explore your topics.
Yeah, and I'm not an expert on Bart Ehrman myself, right? So I'm not a New Testament scholar. But he's definitely one of the most popular, right, New Testament scholar, right, in America today. And given that he is coming from some kind of an agnostic standpoint, so he's definitely viewing the Bible from a different point of view. Okay, not someone who's like us, who read the Bible and we have faith in God, and we have some kind of respect for the authority of the Bible. So he's coming from someone who doesn't have that sort of respect, right? So he of course respect the scriptures as some kind of a classic literary work, okay? But that's probably the extent of whatever respect he has for the Bible, right? I'm not saying that that's wrong or right. I'm simply describing, right, what I think is his relation to the scriptures. Okay. Now, so let me. So instead of what I'll do is I will post on the comment section after we're done the link where I got the gist of his view on the historicity of crucifixion and resurrection. This was actually in a debate that he had with an evangelical Bible scholar. So it's like a 10-minute video. I will put it on the comment section. You can watch it after we discuss it, just in case you're interested. Now, so let me just say something here about some of the things that he said. I took some notes, but this conversation will be impromptu. Okay, we didn't plan what we're going to discuss here, but I'm just going to go over what he said in that particular debate. Okay, can't remember where the debate was held, but you can see it when you actually watch that YouTube video. And this is going to be somehow an appropriate discussion, given that we just finished the Holy Week. I didn't want to do it during the Holy Week, right, to dampen people's spirit. But since we are done with Easter, right, so now we can probably step back and ask some of the hard questions, right, or at least consider some of the hard questions posed by Bart Ehrman. So he said in the debate that the Gospels are, of course, are sources for knowing about the resurrection of Jesus. Okay. And we don't have any other source, right, other than the Gospels. We might have some sources or some allusions to the resurrection of Jesus, right, in some of the other parts of the New Testament text, and some allusions to the resurrected Christ, right, in the work of some ancient historians like Josephus. Now, but our primary source when it comes to knowledge, what we claim to know about the resurrection of Jesus, are actually the primary sources will be the Gospels. But the question he wants to ask is, or that he asked, is that, but are they the kind of sources that historians would want would want when trying to establish what probably happened during that time, right? Given the very nature of the Gospels, um, given the fact that they were not really written by historians, right? Given the fact that they are written by people who have some interest, right, in proving a particular point about Jesus, right? So can we somehow consider that as the kind of materials that historians will want to use, right, to actually establish what probably happened during that time? His answer was a no. Okay. Um, and I seem to agree with him here. And I'll explain later on why I seem to agree with him on this one. But before I do that, let me see if Laurence wants to say something about that.
I don't think I have any opinions. It's usually my opinions are in response to,
Mhm.
maybe a claim that's presented, right? And
Mhm.
so I obviously have a starting point being a committed Roman Catholic, and so as Catholics do, they believe the Bible is the Word of God. It is inerrant. It's not infallible because we define it differently than Protestants define the word infallibility. We will say it's inerrant. It's without error. Is the traditional teaching of the Catholic Church, and the official interpreters of the Scriptures are under the authority of the Church that Christ founded, and obviously our position is Christ founded the Catholic Church, and so that would be my starting point. So any claim sort of contrary to that is something I'd probably have to study if I haven't been presented that material in the past. And so whatever points you'd like to make, I'll just respond to it.
Okay. Okay. And I was just because he made a point that somehow the Gospels are not the kind of historical documents, right, that historians will want to use, right, to establish some facts that happened during that time, right, in the ancient time, the first century. And so I seem to agree with him, right, because I don't think that um, we should actually look at the gospel as giving us, historically, that everything is some kind of a historically factual claim, right, about what happened during that time. I think it might be naive to actually say that the gospels have that intention, right? Given that we know it's common knowledge to people that there are discrepancies, right, or there are differences in their account. So you can't really take that seriously as uh, sources of historical information, right? But that doesn't mean that I think that the Bible is not authoritative. Okay, I believe in the authority of the Bible. I pastor a church that view the centrality of the Bible, right, in whatever it is that we do, from teaching and. But I just don't think that that's true. They're not supposed to be used by historians to determine what happened during that time, right? Good.
Can I ask you, like, maybe you know more about this than I do?
Yeah.
In the early days when I first came back to Christianity, um, I came across some stuff by they made movies. The Case for Christ. What is his name? The Case for
Lee Strobel.
Yeah, Lee Strobel. So
Uh-huh.
I read some of his stuff. I've watched his movies or the movies about him, things like that. I was kind of a devil's advocate at a Bible study at a high school that I was tutoring at. So I went to the Protestant Bible study, and I was like, "Well, what about the Bible?" The claim is that the Bible has errors and stuff, or it has 5,000 manuscripts, and they're not all the same. And they gave me sort of rote rehearsed, almost sounding react. I mean, which is what apologetics is, right? You study how to respond. So that in itself is not a problem. But a lot of the things I recall them saying would be something like, well, if you look at some other historical books, there are only so many copies of them, right? And if you look at how many copies of the Bible there are, even though there are 5,000 manuscripts and all this other stuff, there's just such a vast amount of copies that if you were to take the other books seriously as a historian, why wouldn't you take these books as I mean, that's their argument. I'm not saying that's the Catholic argument, but from a Protestant perspective, where the Bible is your faith. I mean, it's not the faith. What I mean is, for most Protestants, traditional Protestants, what you know about the content of the faith and how you are to interact with the faith is informed by the Bible. So that's all you've got. You don't have a church that's giving you authoritative declarations. And so you have to put your stock in this set of books. Do you have any insights on that? Like, any response to that?
Of course, those kind of apologetics responses, right? They got that from Josh McDowell, right? About the list of manuscripts, right? Of extant copies of early manuscripts of the Bible, that they're like much more numerous, right? In contrast to the works of Plato and some other people. But I don't think that establishes historicity. I think it's wrong to make that leap. That just because there are a lot of copies of some early manuscripts, that somehow justifies historicity, right? It doesn't even justify reliability either, right? Probably the reliability of the translations might be, right? You might be able to actually establish that, but the reliability that it's hard to, or probably they are simply useful in determining what could have been in the original manuscripts, right? But I don't think it established anything more than that, right? It doesn't mean that you prove the historicity of the claims in the Bible, right? Just because you have tons of copies of early manuscripts, right? And I don't know if and then of course for Protestants, given that they don't have popes and some other people who can just simply authoritatively declare, right, what one should believe about certain matters. Um, um, but I think in some sense there are people who function like that, right, in Protestant churches, but it differs for different denominations, right? So there are different denominations will have different guardians, right, of their specific way of looking at Christianity, right? So the Baptists, Southern Baptists, of course, they have their own committee, right, on doctrinal matters that will determine that. Now, of course, but just like in the Catholic Church, right, even if the people who decide or declare on what one should believe, it doesn't mean that all Catholics literally believe those things, right? That's why, even when the Catholic declares that the use of contraception, right, is somehow wrong, right? Catholics still use contraception, right? I don't know. And the same thing with Protestants, right? So there will be authoritative body of people who will make decision on how to interpret certain text, right? On what doctrine should be believed in, right? On what positions one should have on contemporary social issues. But that also does not mean that the members of that particular denomination will really buy whatever it is that the denominational leaders will agree on, right? So I know that when I was in the Assemblies of God, that there's actually a committee of people, right, who literally decide on what are the positions on prosperity gospel, right, abortion, same-sex marriage, and stuff like that. So I know that denominations have something similar.
Yeah. Well, maybe this is in the realm of philosophy. I don't know. I'm not the expert in it, but there's got to be some value to labels, right? There's got to be some value to categorizations, right?
Mhm.
So if I were to say I'm a Catholic,
Yeah.
and just say that, right?
Mm-hmm.
That has to mean something, right? And so, yes, there's different interpretations, and it just depends on who's hearing it.
Yeah.
Now, if a conservative hears that, they'll say, okay, that means he believes that the Pope is the head of the church and the official teaching of the church or the catechism, thing like that. Then you got a progressive Catholic that it might just mean, well, tell us more, because I don't know what that actually means, because a progressive Catholic will define themselves as Catholic, maybe sociologically, as, I don't know, culturally, as something they check off on a box because that's how they were raised. It might be practical because they're a theologian at a Catholic university, but don't necessarily put any stock in papal declarations. So there, I would question the usefulness of identifying oneself as a Baptist, a Southern Baptist. I mean, well, there's probably something that all Baptists hold to, which the term Baptist makes sense. But there's got to be something, otherwise it's meaningless to say I'm a Southern Baptist if it does not distinguish me from a Reformed Baptist or an American Baptist, whatever. I don't know. There's different denominations, right?
Yeah,
there's got to be something, right, that holds that denomination together in distinction to its other flavors.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are Catholics who practice contraception. So you could probably divide those who practice contraception, who believe it's wrong, but have just somehow justified it in their minds because they don't want to have any more kids. So they know they're doing something wrong. So that's already a category of people in themselves. And then you got folks that say, I don't care what the Pope says. I go to Mass every Sunday or once every so often. I still call myself Catholic. I practice contraception, but I still call myself Catholic.
Yeah.
But is that really even helpful? To say this.
No, but again, that's the reality, though, right? That in every denomination, it doesn't matter what the denominational leaders agree on. It doesn't mean that all the people who identify themselves as part of that group, right, adhere to the same position. That's just, ideally it should be like that, right? But in reality, that's not what actually happens. And it's not like this is a new problem. This has always been a problem, right, of the church from the very beginning. There are always people who go against, right, whatever the authority figures, right, decide on. It's true in the earliest church, right? It's true in the history of the Roman Catholic Church. It's true with the Orthodox.
Old Testament.
Yeah, true of the Old Testament. It's true of all groups, right?
And what did Moses do when he came down from Mount Sinai? I mean, it's if they're gonna say they're the God's people, and then they create a golden calf, then they're not worshiping. They're not. I mean, I'm not trying to be. I mean, just saying. That's just in my mind. It's like, okay, do you follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? You know what I mean? Like something like that, right? Is that your God? Or is it a different God?
And I don't necessarily disagree with you. I see myself as an institutionalist, right? An institutionalist in the sense that I do adhere to whatever people above me, right, in the denomination I'm part of, or whatever they decide on certain things. Then I just follow. Doesn't mean I agree, right? But I know I'm bound to follow those rules, right? And if I wanted to disagree, then I can hopefully probably have opportunities to voice out my opinion, right? So and then hopefully.
If I may, but isn't that the real question we should, I mean, as an individual, at least from my perspective, like, I wouldn't stop there and say, well, there's disagreements in the church and I'll just kind of live my own life, right? I would say, well, okay, I recognize there's a certain degree of authority that the Roman Catholic Church has. What are the limits of that authority, right? So if my bishop were to tell me and this was the controversy recently with Pope Francis, is they did this Pachamama thing. I mentioned this before, which is a South American, Mother Earth goddess, and they put it in a church in Rome. And some Catholics went in there and stole the statue and threw it in the Tiber River. And that was a little controversial because it's disrespectful, blah, 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 whatever. But it's idolatry from a Catholic perspective, right? So, it's what are the limit? If a bishop were to tell me, hey, you have to come to church tonight, and we're going to say some prayers to this Pachamama statue, I'm going to say, with all due respect, Bishop, you are a heretic, or you are an apostate, or something like that. I mean, I don't mean to say it in that kind of thing, but that's certainly the language of the early church, to say, look, you are not. You're doing expressly what is expressly forbidden in everywhere in the Bible, to not worship any idols or worship the false gods. So they can't tell me to do that, but can they tell me things within the sphere of their authority? And that's where I need to spend my time for trying to figure out, okay, what are the limits of that authority, and are they going beyond that? And if they are going beyond that, if it's against my conscience, I have an obligation. Not only do I have a right to reject what they're telling me to do, I have the duty to, according to Catholic moral theology, to reject their dictates to me. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what I mean. And same thing with the Bible. What are the limits of its authority? And if it is only partially true, or not infallible, or not inerrant, then I'll act accordingly. But if my starting point is it's inerrant or it's infallible, then I have to take all of it at face value, or whatever it is that it's trying to tell me.
But again, in the midst of conflicting claims in the Bible, how can one actually claim inerrancy? Because that seems absurd to claim it's still inerrant, right? When you already know that there are discrepancies. So that means if there are conflicting claims, at least some of the claims will be false without necessarily affecting, right, the core values or the core principles, right, that the Bible actually wants us to believe in, right? At least that's from my standpoint here. But when we look at Bart Ehrman, for example, right? So he said, when were the Gospels written? So he said they were written 65 to 95 A.D. With Mark being the first one to have been written, at least as far as we can tell, that seems to be the case, right? And then the Gospel of John was written last, probably 90 to or somewhere between 90 to 95 A.D., right? So that's actually how many 40 years after Jesus, right? Because if probably Jesus died around between 30 to 35 AD, and if the first gospel was written in 65, right? So that means a long time have passed, right? And so one can reasonably think about, right, the possibility of corruption of the text, or corruption of the tradition, or corruption of the story. Okay, if not the tradition, but at least the story, the narrative. Of course, Paul wrote around what? He wrote around 50 A.D. So that's actually much earlier than Mark. But still, even though Paul and Jesus, the writing of Paul, or the first epistle of Paul that was written, that was included in the Bible, right? And the death and resurrection of Jesus, despite the fact that it's like 20-year gap. So still, Paul was not an eyewitness, right? And then so that's part of the argument of Bart Ehrman, right? That there's no eyewitness account. Even the Gospels were not eyewitnesses accounts, right, of Jesus's resurrection. The reason why I said that, because it cannot be coming from, it must not, they must not have been written by the disciples, given that the disciples are actually known to be illiterate people, right? So they cannot read and write. And then, um, and that's actually true of the vast majority of people during that time. And then the weird thing is that the Gospels were actually written in Greek, but the disciples actually spoke Aramaic, right? They were Aramaic speaking peasants from Galilee. So they were uneducated, according to Ehrman. They are, lower class people. But when you actually look at the Gospels, I think especially probably the Gospel of Luke, right? Written by highly literate Greek-speaking Christians, and we don't know who wrote the Gospels, given that it was not indicated in the text who actually wrote them. They were actually anonymously written, right? I know that we looked at the church fathers to determine probably who wrote Matthew, because somebody said, right, that Matthew is the one who wrote the Gospel of Matthew, right? Or Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark. But you also have to understand that the church fathers are also detached from, right? The writings of the Gospels. So they're actually what, probably 50 years after or 40 years after, right? The writings of Mark, for example. Okay. So according to Bart Ehrman, that should give you a reason to actually doubt the historical reliability of the claims in the Gospels, given that stories inevitably will be modified, as they get transmitted, right, from one generation to the next. So you have oral tradition put in some kind of written form at some point, and then this process of just transmitting oral tradition, transmitting or even written work, right, like the Gospels, right? They are prone to be corrupted in the process. Okay. I don't know if you wanted to say something about that, but that's pretty much the point of Ehrman, which I think
Yeah.
they are actually factual points, right? They are probably claims that has some level of verifiability. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I don't. If I were an atheist still, if I was an agnostic or something,
Mhm,
and then I'd listen to Bart Ehrman, I'd say, oh, he has good points.
mhm, mhm.
I mean, not that I don't say he has good points now,
Yeah.
but I would admit he has good points if my starting point were that I was an atheist or agnostic. I mean, ultimately, I think we look at scholar. There's so much information out there. Look, I mean, 50 years ago, before the internet, what you could learn is probably limited to your college education or your local library. That's it, right? I mean, you don't. You can't really go beyond that, right?
Mm.
I probably would never have heard of a Bart Ehrman if we're talking about 1950 right now. The people who would know about him are scholarly folks, or the people going to his university and learning from him wherever he's teaching, right? I mean, if we were in those days, I mean, now he could be on the other side of the world, and you can learn from him. You can watch, you can call him up on Skype and actually have a conversation with him. Throw $50 or $150 at him, and he'd probably talk to you, or probably more than that because he's a big name. So my point is that we seek. I think on a practical level, we seek out sources that we find trustworthy. Just on a human level, we find trustworthy, right? And so for me, most of my books are like Catholic or Catholic oriented or conservative oriented because I find that perspective trustworthy because I'm a conservative, right? I sprinkle my shelves with a lot of other kinds of books. I have 5 or 6 Bart Ehrman books, but for me, they're references. I mean, references to that perspective. I don't take it seriously because I don't agree with him. He's not a believer. So what do I have to learn I mean, like seriously. I mean, I could learn tidbits of historical critical method or something like that, but I'm not looking at his material to learn something about my faith. I don't know if that makes sense. Maybe that sounds very, I'm myopic and I'm trying, but that's how people, right? I'm not under any illusion either that the followers of Bart Ehrman are reading the fathers of the church, are reading Catholic theologians or what's Cardinal Ratzinger think about that? They're not reading Cardinal Ratzinger, the followers of Bart Ehrman. They're not reading the research of conservative Catholics or conservative Protestants. I mean, I don't know. Are they? I doubt it, right? Mm. They all quote each other's stuff, and it's the same thing for every camp. Conservative Catholics, they all quote each other's books. Progressive Catholics, they all quote each other's books. I mean, how do I know this? Because when I read each of those books, they never quote each other. Hardly ever, unless they're critiquing that work, that body of work. So what is my point? My point is to say, I think he's starting off, he is an agnostic now, and his books are appealing to the folks that are already on that trajectory, right? They're already doubtful, and his methodology is are people on the fence, and he's calling into question the historicity of it. It doesn't put cracks in the foundation of a conservative Catholic, in my opinion, because I don't start off looking at the Bible as a historical book that I need to somehow justify my sacramental theology on the historical credibility of the New Testament. I already said this in our earlier interviews. My trust is not even in the Bible in itself, right? I remember when we had that first Bible study, you had two guests or three guests, and I said, "How do you know this is the Word of God?" I mean, for a Protestant, you start off with that assumption. My assumption doesn't start off that this is the Word of God, or at least that's not where I come from. I put my trust in the fact that there is a historical institution that preserved a bunch of texts that at some point they put together in the 4th century and said, here's a list of books that have been circulated. We've collated them. We've looked at the Gnostic stuff. We've looked at the other stuff. We've looked, the 200 Gospels that are alleged, but we got 4. And here are Pauline's epistles. We lost 1 Corinthians, but hey, we'll call this 1 Corinthians. We'll call this, whatever it is that they did. My trust is in that institution, and that institution gave me not this book. This is the King James version, but it gave me one of those books over there, right? That's or at least one of the Catholic. Well, I shouldn't say the translation. It gave us the Latin Vulgate first, right, as an official Catholic Bible, and then later on you got the Douay Rhymes and all these other things. So that's my starting point. I don't know if all that makes sense, but so all the stuff that Bart Ehrman is trying to claim is interesting to me, but ultimately it doesn't cast doubt, because I don't start off with wanting to prove the historical value of these books. I trust that they're historically true because the church told me they're true.
Yeah. So I think that's where I probably have a problem with your stance, right? One is I think as an epistemological method, right? It might be problematic already. I start with the beliefs that I inherited from the church, and then I go from there, right? And that's your starting point. But what if they can be proven as false? What if they can be it can be demonstrated that some of those beliefs, right, are not even plausible, right? And so that's already that already thwarts your process of understanding things, because you are already influenced by some set of beliefs, right, that are problematic to begin with. I'm not saying that that's true with the Catholic Church. I'm simply pointing out that one can easily demonstrate, right, some problematic claims, right, in the Roman Catholic Church that might not stand, robust scrutiny, right?
Well, I think
So
we talked about some of those
yeah,
topics,
yeah,
but we have we can't just blanket, and just say like that that's the thing, and we can point to it, because some of the viewers, and probably most of the viewers who are probably Protestant. I don't think too many of my Catholic
yeah.
brothers and sisters are watching this show, but
Mhm.
they can say, oh yeah, of course, yeah, the Crusades, and of course the evolution, of course, that the earth is the center of the universe, and this and that, all that stuff, because that's already something that's in their understanding of the Catholic Church was wrong on those things. But the question is, what is the Catholic response to some of those things? And if we did a show on each one of those topics, I suppose we could venture into it. But the question would be, are those things even in the category that I'm talking about? Like I was merely limiting it to simply, how do I know that the Bible is the Word of God?
Mhm.
I mean, forget about the rest of the doctrines of the Catholic Church that have accumulated for 2,000 years. At its basic level, something that a Catholic and a Protestant can start off with: how do we know that the Bible is the Word of God? And is it? Right?
Yeah,
So
but
between a Protestant who believes it is and a Catholic who believes it is the Word of God, and we agree with that, well, how did it come to be? So we can start chipping away at some of
no, yeah.
these claims and ideas.
But you can claim it's the word of God without assuming inerrancy, right? It's a word of God in the
Yeah.
sense that it embodies certain, principles, right? That can serve as bearers of truth. And of course, but my other
Yeah.
problem with your claim a while ago, before I forget to mention to point this out, is that Bart Ehrman's claims are objective, right? They're not like these are not his preferences, right? These are not the beliefs that he preferred to be true. These are objective claims. So when he said that there is this 40-year gap, right, between first gospel written down, right, and then the event that it's trying to represent, right, that is an objective claim. And then if you say in the span of 40 years, right, what's the likelihood that the stories can actually be corrupted? Of course, that's not a subjective claim, right? We know that stories get corrupted
Well,
as time
I know that's
passes.
true.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I used that as an argument against Protestants,
Mm-hmm.
to be honest, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because, again, with a starting point of being Catholic, we are not sola scripturis. We don't say the Bible is the sole rule of faith. That is what sola scriptura is for a conservative Protestant. So I would definitely agree with that. I was in a debate on the Da Vinci Code 15 years ago with one of these historical, kind of individual. They went to seminary, they got Ph.D.s and all these other things. So we were talking about the Da Vinci Code, and that was part of the foundation of the historical reliability of the New Testament, that kind of a thing. Because the Catholic doesn't need the scriptures, the written scriptures. I mean, we would say in our apologetics, nowhere did Jesus say ever write a single thing. He's never quoted in the Bible saying, write this down before you forget it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He didn't say that, or he might have said that, but it just wasn't written down. So would the Christian faith have propagated even if you didn't have a single scripture written down? Well, possibly. I mean, it's not beyond the realm of possibilities, because you have Paul saying, hold fast to the traditions, whether I said it to you or I wrote it to you. He didn't even say, the things I'm saying to you, make sure you write that stuff down in case you forget it, right? He says, hold fast to the traditions. And I don't know how true this is, but some things that I read was that the Jews of the day were still a very much a verbal culture. Right? One of those things, I don't know what the anthropological term for that is, but it's one of those cultures that put a lot of pride in oral tradition and oral transmission. And it's not just hey, I went fishing and here I caught this big fish, and then 2 months down the line it becomes a tall tale. It's a kind of culture where there is allegedly, that I'm not a scholar in this, so I'm just saying, I'm just regurgitating what I've been what I've learned, is that it's a lot of attention to detail, that if you were to even deviate from the story, that there's actually people in the culture or in the community that would I don't know what you'd say. They'd punish you, I guess you can say, for deviating from the story that you're supposed to be memorizing and handing on. So if that's the case, then I don't have that. I'm not convinced by the appeal to say, well, of course they're going to forget some of the details, because we're thinking of 21st century. Like, I don't even remember what I did today. Like, if you were to ask me right now, what did I don't remember what I did this morning, in detail. I have to really think about it, as opposed to a culture where, I don't know if any of this is
No,
making sense.
but even when you look at those scribal traditions, right? The scribes who, mistranslated things, right? Left out some words, right? Because there are actually discrepancies, right, in the extant manuscripts, right? That there are misspelled words. So the fallibility of humans, right? And the fact that even when you say that Jewish people are very careful in transmitting oral tradition, right? But it's hard to say whether what they are actually, how they understand those teachings today, right, even correspond to how those people in the past even conceive of those teachings, right? Given that along the way, right, you are reinterpreting what it is that you're transmitting to people, right, all the time. And that's just a fact of that's just what happens, right?
Can you give an example of
mm,
an evolution of scriptural, a thing that was in the earlier manuscripts that don't? I know there are some examples,
yeah.
but since you're mentioning it, do you have that in mind? I mean, is that what?
No,
Are you talking about certain
if you
scriptures?
actually read, like, I don't know, I'm assuming in the book by Bart Ehrman, Misquoting Jesus, right? That's where he came up with a lot of examples of those, right? So there are actual examples, but I haven't read. I haven't read the. I read the book like a while back, right? So I don't remember the
I just
exact
bought the book.
examples.
I just bought the
Oh, you
book
just
three
bought it.
days
Okay.
ago, and that was
Mm-hmm.
even before
Mm-hmm.
you told me this topic.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to look into them. See, the question for me then is,
Mm-hmm.
okay, there's a claim,
Mm-hmm.
but now I have to look at the claim and see if there's even a response to it,
Yeah, yeah.
right? So I'm not going to accept that
Mm-hmm.
Bart Ehrman is making this claim, and because just because he makes the claim doesn't mean there is no
No, no, of
response.
course, but those are he's talking about, like, these are demonstrable scribal errors, right? Because you're looking at manuscripts that are different, okay? So it's not like it's based on some interpretation. These are there's actually the use of I don't know the specific example, but the use of terms that are almost like exactly the same, right? How it is actually spelled, but probably it differs in like one word, right? And then you see that there was actually something like that going on, right? A mistake, right? In the even though anyone who actually mistranslated, right, might get punished for that, right? But probably they didn't even know someone mistranslated it, right? That's the thing, right? So errors are actually, it's possible that it or it's likely that something like that will happen given the span of time, right?
You know,
And that's just the claim that he's making here, which is, I think, is very, very reasonable, right? So so for example, right, and again, so the kind of let's say the discrepancy, since I mentioned that. So I have here Bart Ehrman saying evidence that stories about Jesus had been changed as they were passed on, right? So stunning differences and discrepancies in the gospel accounts. For example, you mentioned this a while ago, the day of Jesus's death, right? Different in Mark and different in John. It's different in Mark and John, right? The Gospels of Mark and John. For Mark, it was after the Passover meal, right? For John, it was before the Passover meal, right? Mark says that Jesus died at 9 a.m., right? While John says Jesus died in the afternoon, right? One gospel says, Jesus carried the cross the whole time. Another gospel says that Joseph of, no, who was the one who carried Simon of, is it Simon? The one who carried the cross?
oh,
Uh,
is it?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, I think
Simon.
it was Simon, right? There was a guy,
For sure.
Simon, who actually carried the cross for a while, temporarily for Jesus. Some gospel says both robbers mocked Jesus, right? And another one says no, only one, right? And then one gospel says the temple curtain was ripped before death. Another one says it was ripped after death, right? Yeah, one gospel says Mary went to the tomb by herself, right? Another one says no, Mary with other women actually went to the tomb to visit the tomb. One gospel says the stone was somehow rolled away, right? Another gospel says no, the stone was not rolled away. There's one gospel that talks about one man by the tomb, right, or two men, and then another one says it's an angel. Now, there's an account where Jesus said that you ought to stay in Jerusalem, telling the disciples that, right? And then another account says you have to go to Galilee. Now, so the point is that there are discrepancies in the stories that should preclude, right, or at least make it problematic or questionable to claim inerrancy, right, or to claim 100% historical reliability. At least for Ehrman, these are not useful historical sources, given that they actually give you conflicting accounts of the details of the story. Now, I don't think that that challenges the authority of the scriptures, right?
I
Because
do.
I don't, right? I don't think that those challenges the authority of the
I might
scriptures.
be an atheist tomorrow once I start looking at this stuff. I mean,
Yeah,
be honest with you.
yeah, yeah.
I haven't looked at these claims that Bart Ehrman points out. I mean, every once in a while, like for example, like here's one that I know of that I've looked into,
Mhm.
right? Good Friday is Friday,
Yeah.
right? Easter is Sunday. In the scriptures, it says Jesus would be in the belly of the earth, just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale 3 days and 3 nights. Now, how do you fit 3 days and 3 nights between Friday afternoon or morning, if it's Mark's gospel, right? And Sunday. You don't have 3 nights. You got 2 nights, Friday night, Saturday night. Yes?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so the Bible is lying to us.
I don't think it's
If I just wanted to look at that, just kind of, if I don't have any interest in trying to find an answer, and I just look at that and say, the tradition of the church, Jesus died on Friday, that's Good Friday, and he resurrected on Sunday. Most Protestants agree with that, right?
Mm.
They died on Friday because the Passover was Thursday. Well, I mean, I suppose it depends on your the interpretation, I guess you can say.
Mm.
And so, because the Holy Thursday in tradition is the Last Supper, so the Passover must have been on a Thursday, right? So, if that's the case, then so there's no 2 days and 2 nights. So, what's the answer? Right? So you could conclude, if you still want to hold on to your faith, well, it's just there's a mistake there somehow, right? But it's such a glaring mistake. How many millions of Christians over the course of 2,000 years didn't stop to think, wait a minute, where's the 3 days and 3 nights between Friday and Sunday? The Orthodox and the Catholics have been celebrating Good Friday and Easter Sunday for 2,000 years. And nobody has an answer to that. Well, there is an answer to that theologically, but I won't get into it because it's very complicated. But there is an answer to that, and it goes beyond the literal kind of analysis of just thinking he died on Friday. So the question is, what is the interpretation of in the belly of the earth? Yeah. Are we talking about his literal death on Good Friday, or the moment in which Christ gave up divine protection by the Father and gave himself up to the world, or to be taken in by the Sanhedrin, right? Yeah. Which occurred, if you watch I'm not saying that the authority is Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, but it is in the scriptures, right? The agony in the garden, right, where he prayed, and then the apostles fell asleep, and have you no faith? You're not paying, that kind of a thing. So if theology interprets the belly of the earth as that moment, then you do have 3 nights and 3 days, and not just the literal. So I'm just saying, that's one case where someone can, a person like Bart Ehrman can say, clearly a glaring, discrepancy, and theology has an answer for it. Well, I don't know. Maybe there's a theological answer to every one of his, is there more than? Here's something I might ask. I'm not a scholar of Judaism. Yeah. Is there more than one Passover? Mm-hmm. Is that possible? I mean, I don't know. Is there? Because there's different festivals and ceremonies in Jewish tradition. But maybe the answer is there's more than one kind of Passover, and he died before one Passover, and I don't know. I haven't looked into
but I think there's something dangerous about that way of of theologizing, right? Things that should be that are obviously intended to be read literally, right? Because you can always come up with a theologically imaginative way of explaining things, right? And argue that must be how one should interpret it. But when you do it that way, I think then it becomes you are going outside the parameters, right, of how those passages should be interpreted, right? Because you can go in all sorts of different ways to defend whatever view you wanted to defend.
I mean, if the early church interpreted it that way, and you can find a quote, I mean, I'm better with that than if a modern theologian comes up with a solution. Yeah. I would hold that suspect, because we didn't have someone talking about it for 2,000 years, and now we have someone. Yeah, I wouldn't put stock in that. Even if it was like 50 years, 100 years later, and they throw in that interpretation, it might have been verbally talked about, and then only commented about 100 years later. Mm-hmm. That's possible. Yeah. But again, going back to my original point is to say, or my reason of saying this is if the Bible, for me as a Catholic, where I stand now, I'm not willing to dispense with the foundational Catholic perspective, and just say, well, okay, it's just a general thing. It's all or nothing for me. So if all of this doesn't hold true, for me, it's all garbage, And maybe there is a God, but it's not this biblical Christian God. Mm-hmm. Because I wouldn't know how to collate anything of this book on what's true and what's not. I don't have the time for that.
But like what I said a while ago, I don't think this challenges so for example, how come it doesn't challenge my faith even if I agree with whatever it is that he's saying, that there are discrepancies? Because I think the discrepancies are not about the core thing, right? The core thing is actually that Jesus resurrected from the dead. I didn't see, right, two different gospel writers saying, one says Jesus resurrected and the other one says Jesus did not resurrect, right? These are, they are claiming something about that Jesus, they all claimed, right, that Jesus resurrected from the dead. The disciples seemingly claimed, at least as we can glean from the book of Acts, right, that Jesus, they believed that Jesus resurrected from the dead, right? So I don't think there's anything conflicting here. The conflicting thing must be the details, right? But the details here, irrespective of which one is true, does not really affect, right, the main thing, right, which is the resurrection of Jesus,
Okay.
that they believe that he resurrected.
Sure. I
Yeah.
can understand that kind of hermeneutic. Okay.
Yeah.
If there are conflicts, allegedly, if there is this,
Yeah.
if we can show that if definitively these are conflicts between the gospels, and then we just and our thing is to just let's save Christianity as much as we can. All right. The three synoptic gospels all agree
Yeah.
that Jesus died and Jesus resurrected. Well, there are folks in the camp of Bart Ehrman, or even ones that still identify themselves as Christian, who make the claim that the Gospel of John is the only one that makes any divine claims about Jesus. So is Jesus not God? I mean, is that something we'll dispense with? Because it's not clear that Jesus is deity in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, because it was written later. We find, I mean, I have a book here, the something about Paul. It was written by a Jewish person. It's one. I guess it was a famous book 20 years ago, but basically it was talking about how the God Jesus was a creation of the Apostle Paul. I mean, and then of course the Gospel of John. But the point is that there's this development of understanding of who Jesus was. So do we dispense with that when I think that's a core teaching of Christianity of any flavor? Well, maybe there's some exceptions that Jesus is God.
Mhm.
At least there's hints, right? But there is a school of thought that it's only developed till later. So do we doubt that because it's not found in all four gospels? And why would we not? I have a book over there, the Gnostic Gospels, and then I bought the Gospel of Thomas the other day as well.
Yeah.
What does the Gospel of Thomas teach? Why are we excluding some of the ideas there that exonerate Judas as the one who's been better off never been being born, when really he's the core of the whole story? Why do we exclude that? Oh, because it was written later.
Yeah.
Second
For
century.
me,
Something
at
like
least
that.
my argument will be, we stick with first century work, right? Because those are the closest one we got, right, to the event that's being accounted for, right? And you stick with that just because that's the only thing we got. Okay, so you have to treat that as authoritative, right? Because for me, for example, I didn't become a Christian because I read the Bible, right? I became a Christian because I probably have some kind of an encounter with Christ, right? And then after you have that encounter, now you have to make sense of what it is that you have encountered with, right? And since the only account about Jesus, you find it in the Bible, right? At least the earliest one, the Gospels, right? And then the Epistles of Paul. So you just have to resort to that, and because you have no other choice. Is it fallible? Yes. Can you be mistaken about the conclusions that you will make? Yes. Right. Are there errors, right, in the text? Yes. Right. I think those are things that can be proven. And so what? But we have no other choice to actually make sense of this encounter that I have with Jesus,
Sure.
right? That becomes the starting point for me,
So,
right?
from what I recall of your story,
Uh,
you had a predisposed faith. I mean, you had a faith in in what you understood to be the Christian God,
yeah.
and you were provided for.
Mhm.
But how do you know it was the Christian God that answered your prayer?
Of course, you're not gonna know that. I don't think the question is not how do you know, right? But
Oh, I guess. Well,
that
my
is
later
going to
question.
be that's going to be the
Yeah,
hope that I will have, right?
but in theory, it could be any God that
Mhm.
doesn't care what name you call him or her or
Yeah,
them,
yeah, of course.
right?
Mhm.
So then why are you attracted to the Christian texts as a way of understanding a little bit more about this deity that you had an encounter with,
Mhm.
rather than the Tao Te Ching or some other kind of
Yeah, because
um,
the encounter is very much Christian-like, right? Because that's what I'm
mm,
accustomed to, right?
mhm,
And
okay.
so and then so the fact that it is very Christian-like, right? So that's why you begin by looking at the biblical text, right? That's what it is, right? So you begin to understand. Right? Whatever understanding of God you will be informed by the biblical text.
Mm.
But can it be of error? Yes, right. But like what I said, but you have no other choice. Where else can you
Start
go?
reading the Quran.
Yeah,
Maybe the Quran gives
yeah.
you better.
No, no,
There's no there's no
but
contradictions in the Quran because it's all written by the same. There's no gospels.
yeah, yeah, but that's the thing, right? So, but because the experience is, it's Christian-like, right? And that's
Yeah,
the reason why, that's the context of the formation of my belief, right?
yeah.
But the thing is, when I look at Bart Ehrman, I don't really disagree with him. I do think that yeah, there are discrepancies. So what? The discrepancies really have nothing to do with the main thing, right? Namely the resurrection, right? It didn't. It's not saying there's no conflicting claims among those literary works, right? About whether Jesus resurrected from the dead. They confirm, right, that Jesus resurrected from the dead, right?
Mm.
But they just have the details are. I consider the details to be not detrimental, right, to the actual event of the resurrection, right? Whether there was Mary Magdalene, Mary who first went to the tomb, or whether she went with other women, it doesn't really matter, right? Those
Mm.
are actually peripheral worries that one should have and that one should expect,
Mm.
because when people tell stories, there are also peripheral claims that people will make that will not jibe together, right? Even if they're talking about the same story. Um,
Isn't it one of his ideas that the other synoptics copied Mark? Is that not his?
I think that might be his view. I think because that's common among
But it's common. It's
critical
common
Bible
among
scholars. Yeah,
critical scholars,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Even ones that still identify as Christians.
yeah,
That there's Mark in priority, even though the tradition of the church is that Matthew comes first. It's in the order in which tradition says they were written: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's in that order for a reason. But the modern scholars will say it's Mark. Okay, is this shortest?
yeah.
Right? I feel it's an assumption, but okay. You would expect the first one to be the shortest, and because it goes along with that narrative of accretions, elaborations, um, innovations, right? John being the longest of the four gospels, right? So it just
Um,
makes sense,
no, no.
right?
John is also not because it's the longest, right? Because I think
Or I should
it's
say
much
it's more
more
theological
theologically
in nature
rich
rather than
already, right?
historical.
Yeah.
So okay, so then if Matthew and Luke copied from Mark,
Mhm.
okay, I'm a critical scholar now. Here's my theory.
Uh-huh.
Get rid of my Catholic side here. This is my critical. So Mark is first. If Luke and Matthew were copying and trusting that Mark is accurately telling a story or whatever it is, but I have a different audience to write to,
Mhm.
and I'm just kind of copying in my version or whatever. Of course, I'm going to get some things the same, and maybe differentiate on some of the details. But if I'm merely copying Mark, does it make it more plausible that there is a crucifixion, death, resurrection, or whatever? If my theory is they're just copying Mark. Well, Mark said there is a crucifixion, and whatever. So if I'm just copying them, why does it make it more believable just because it's consistent among the three? Well, it's the core of the story. That's why it agrees, right? But it doesn't necessarily make it more believable if the first one was BS. The first one was making stuff up. You know, anyway. So either you can't have your cake and eat it too. Either you believe these are three independent witnesses in a court, and I don't mean to sound like Josh McDowell, but I think that's how he paints this picture. You have three witnesses in the court of law, and they're all giving you different. That's called a Tatian, right? There's a historical guy named Tatian, right, that did this. It's the harmonization of the Gospels, right? So it's not so much that because they left out a couple of people here and they mention it here, it doesn't mean those people weren't there. It just means that this witness didn't care enough to say that there were people there. I don't know. I'm just generalizing. So somehow there's this hermeneutic in the early centuries to try to harmonize them and say all of them are true, and none of them are necessarily contradicting the other details. It's just kind of filling in the gaps somehow. I don't know if that works. I really don't. I just know it's been a way of trying to answer some of these things. And without having actually done the work of looking into the claims, there's no way for me to answer that here in a 1 hour conversation unless we actually go into it and say, here's Mark, here's there's the Passover. Well, clearly they're contradictory. Well, let's look up some other author that tries to explain it. Well, maybe their explanation is even more compelling than Ehrman. I don't know, just because they're not as globally known
but I think scholars tend to agree with the basic claims, right, that he makes, right? So they will agree that
scholars, which scholars though, not Catholic ones.
No, even prominent Catholic scholars will agree because these are common knowledge to them, right? I don't think there's a distinction between what Catholics will say about whether Mark was actually written before Matthew. There's some kind of a standard claims that they agree on, right? That's the reason why I doubt that New Testament scholars at Notre Dame, right, will reject many of the claims of Bart Ehrman, right? I'm pretty sure most of them will probably agree, right, with whatever it is that he's saying here, right? So because these are basic information about the dating, right? When was it written, right? The fact that the authors were anonymous, right? Those are things that are common knowledge to these people.
No, I mean, well, there's different theories out there. J.A.T. Robinson has an early dating of the New Testament, all of them dating within the first 2 generations after Christ. Now, you might not know who J.A.T. Robinson is. He's not as
he's from
well known, but and he's an older generation. I mean, I don't know. I mean, honestly,
no, I'm talking about.
I'm not seminary trained.
No, I'm talking about. The dating, people are in agreement, people who are of the same time. Of course, things change, right, as you develop, right?
Sure.
So the consensus change, but they tend to converge on many things, right? That's why there are things that you can claim objectively because they converge on certain things, right? So I'm pretty sure they all agree, most of them, at least the critical scholars will agree that John was actually written later. Right.
95 and past the century. But one of the theories, and I don't know if it's been debunked. I'm pretty sure the other theories also have explanatory power, but none of the New Testament texts give any reference to, or maybe I'm wrong on this, but maybe this is my understanding. They don't give any reference to the historically important event of the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem in 70. Where is that in the? I mean, well, one person might say, well, just because it's not there doesn't mean it necessarily wasn't written after. But Wouldn't that be an important thing to write about in the New
But
Testament?
I thought there were actually some New Testament passages that might have alluded to that the temple destruction, right?
Not
And
not explicitly.
that's the reason why that's how they do the dating, right? Because if there's a passage that seemed to suggest alluding to that particular event, right? Then that
Mm,
means this letter must have been written after, right? And that's how they actually do the dating, right?
mm,
When you look at some other text that does not seem to that do not seem to assume, right, any
mm.
reference or any allusion to that, then probably that must have been written prior to that, right? Of
Right.
course, is it possible that it probably written after they just didn't mention it, right? Yes, of course, right.
Yeah.
But they're just taking all of this into account, right, when they're actually trying to figure out how to place the dating for each scriptural text.
Well, see, this is clearly getting into the point I was making earlier. It's
Yeah,
like, look, I'm not gonna be a specialist in this.
yeah.
I'm just not. You teach philosophy, I do psychology, and I do work in the community. I don't have the time to be an expert in this kind of New Testament, this and that, and that's dated that time. I mean, the best I could do is I put my trust in a certain body of scholarship. The folks that I read are not the Notre Dame theologians that you're talking about.
Yeah,
They're biblical scholars like Robert Sungenis, like I said. Scott Hahn, who has a lot more notoriety in terms of scholarship and popularity, but he's not in the same circles as your as Bart Ehrman and the folks at Notre Dame. John Bergsma. These are professors of theology and biblical scholarship, biblical studies at big Catholic universities, but they're not like the Notre Dames and Boston College. You know, I
again,
would say those institutions though have not signed Ex Corde Ecclesiae, which is one of those things that John Paul II said. Well, if you want to be known as a Catholic university, you have to sign this this allegiance
yeah.
to the Catholic Church, and
Yeah.
those institutions are not those kinds of institutions.
But again, even in Protestantism or evangelicalism, like let's just look at evangelicalism, there are also a variety of groups of scholars, right? So you have the moderate people, right? And you have the ones who are engaged in a much larger group of people that assume standard assumptions, and then you also have a group of people who teach in like fundamentalist evangelical schools who got their PhDs from fundamentalist
From the
evangelical
same schools, yeah,
seminary,
no, I get it,
right?
yeah.
And then
Which makes sense.
yeah, mhm,
Which makes sense. That's their tribe.
yeah. And
So
but that's the thing. But the point is, there are objective things you can talk about, right? So for example, even when you actually look at, let's say, the fundamentalist evangelicals who graduated from fundamentalist evangelical seminary, right? They will read the text with some kind of naive literalism, right? And they will take things literally. They will read everything literally, right? And so some people might be able to point out, right, that there's probably something wrong with approaching the text with that kind of naive literalism, right? Given that some passages in the Bible are not necessarily, they're not supposed to be taken literally, right? Some passages in the Bible might be poetic, right? But they will actually take that as a literal account of something, right? Now, but to continue here, sorry, let me just. Uh, Bart Ehrman says the real problem for him is that historians try to establish what probably happened in the past, right? That's what they're trying to do. But they cannot prove the past, but so they can only establish it like probabilistically, right? They can only give evidence of the past, but the problem is that miracles such as the resurrection are least probable to occur because it is miraculous, right? If not least probable, um, if it is not if it is not the least probable, then it will not be a miracle, right? The reason why it's miraculous because it was the least probable to happen. So the chances that a man can walk on water are infinitesimally remote, right? According to Bart Ehrman. History, unlike natural science, is unrepeatable. So the point that he wants to make is that this is the problem. Then, right? You cannot really prove a historical event. Okay, and then it will be hard to prove that the most probable thing that happened is the one that is actually the least probable to happen, such as the resurrection. So why assume? Again, I think what he's doing here is that he's attacking evangelical apologists, right? Who will claim, oh, so the most probable interpretation is that Jesus resurrected from the dead. But that might be, I agree with Ehrman here, that that is an overstatement, right? It is not the most probable thing that could have happened. That's why I will only emphasize that I will only try to prove possibility rather than the probability, right, of resurrection. I think it's possible, right? But I think we don't have enough to actually make that judgment that that is the most probable thing that actually happened, that that is the most probable explanation, right, for what happened here. And I think it's, but I also disagree with Ehrman here when he said that, right? It is not true, right, that the least probable, right, or the most probable, or the least probable cannot be the most probable. I don't know if I'm making sense when I say that. Let me give you an example here, right? And then probably I don't know if this is probably let me see. Okay, I think I disagree with him on that one. Why? So suppose that my neighbor Randy, right, buys a lottery ticket, right, once a year on mid-April. So it is the least probable to occur that Randy will win, right, the lottery, because he only does it once a year and he only buys one ticket, right, and he does it on mid-April. But suppose I found out that my neighbor Randy, right, bought a house worth millions of dollars, right, and bought a $200,000 car, right, around the first week of May. All right. So it's the least probable to happen that he will win, right, the lottery, but given certain set of surrounding events, such as him buying $1 million homes, right, and buying a $200,000 car, right, that is actually the most probable thing the most probable thing that happened is that Randy won the lottery, right, in mid-April, right. So the point I'm trying to make is that the fact that it is the least probable, right, it cannot be the most probable. Yes, it is the least probable that Jesus resurrected from the dead because people do not resurrect from the dead. But given certain surrounding conditions or situations, it can be the case that it is the most probable, right? I'm not saying that it is. I'm just simply claiming, I'm attacking his claim that the least probable cannot be the most probable, because that's not true. In the story about my neighbor Randy, right? That's the least probable can be the most probable. I don't know if I'm making sense here. And
Yeah, I think it makes sense.
yeah.
But you're talking about probable from looking at two different things, right?
Yes. I think he's conflating the two. Ehrman.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because
You're saying probability, like what's the probability of winning the lotto? It's a very set numerical value,
yes,
right?
yes, yeah,
So it's not likely to happen.
yeah,
But when you look at a certain set of evidence around it and you have to make a judgment, where do you think this person got all their money from?
yeah,
I mean, it could be that. It could be that he won the lottery. It could be that he he inherited something too.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You know,
Yeah, but the point is that
like
it's
that.
it's gonna be you have to add certain details then, right, to
Sure,
make
sure.
it more probable. The point is that I want to make is that the least probable, all things considered,
Yeah,
right, is going to be different from the most probable given certain special considerations,
yeah,
right? With the resurrection of Jesus, is you have to think about, okay, they claim that he resurrected from the dead, right? So there must have been some eyewitnesses, and Paul must have encountered some of them.
mm,
Yeah, is that, and then Paul seems to be trustworthy, right? He doesn't look like he's lying, right? And he
yeah,
doesn't seem to question the credibility of the people who's telling him that Jesus resurrected from the dead, right?
mm,
And then given that resurrection is possible, right? It might not be, resurrection seems to be possible in a way, right? So for example, we might be able to resuscitate someone, right, who supposedly have died, right,
yeah,
and then brought it back to life. So that might be a possibility, right? I don't think that is impossible. So given that that is possible, and then given that there were actually reports of people who have seen the risen Christ, and Paul met them supposedly, right? He didn't actually question their credibility, and Paul seems to be some kind of a trustworthy person, right? And then so one can conclude that, yeah, it seems, given those kind of considerations, right? It can be it might be like the most probable, right? That Jesus must have resurrected from the dead, right? Even though it is the least probable, all things considered.
mm, mm, mm.
Does that
Yeah,
make sense?
yeah,
And then I think that probably Ehrman is conflating or confusing the two, and that's why I will not agree with his last point there.
mhm,
Given that I think that I don't know if the least probable cannot be the most probable, because it looks like the least probable can be the most probable, right? Given certain considerations,
mhm.
because there are things that happen that are less likely to happen, but it just happened, right?
Yeah, because well, I mean, if you're saying it's impossible, then obviously then it could never happen.
Yeah,
But just the fact that they're just the fact just the fact that some people do win the lottery
yeah,
should be enough for those who believe in the lottery to keep playing the lottery.
yeah, yeah,
Right? I mean, somebody does win. You do see them, unless you're saying they're actors.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
but yeah, that's the thing. You have verification. I mean, of course, you're going to believe in something that actually happened. But you know, uh, we do these raffles at work, and we advertise that if you do these activities, you have a chance to win. Well, as it happened, there's people who have faith that they could win that raffle,
mhm,
but there was some misunderstanding, and there's some policy relating to raffles and whatever, and we couldn't do it.
mhm,
So we never announced any winners. The people probably still believed they had a chance to win,
yeah,
but in all true fact, reality, nobody won.
yeah, yeah,
We didn't take any money. We didn't steal any money or anything. It was just had to do with their activities, and we give them a gift card or something like that.
yeah,
But it just didn't work out. And so it's one thing if we're like, okay, we're going to announce on one day we're going to have winners. So you have verification. This is a legit enterprise here that's happening. But we didn't say we're going to announce, and so it actually didn't happen. I don't know if that's relevant to what we're talking about, but
but
but maybe is resurrection even in the realm of possibilities? Well, some people would say no, it's not even in the realm of possibilities at all.
yeah, but I think it's conceivable. If it's conceivable, it's possible.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you talk to a true atheist.
Yeah. Can I
If you
can
were to
I
press them,
can I be excused for a
sure,
little bit?
sure,
I'm just gonna go use the restroom really quick.
sure,
Sorry.
sure.
I
I'll pause my thing.
yeah, sorry. Sorry for the intermission there. Uh, I cannot stand without using the restroom, or I cannot last for an hour and a half, right, without using the restroom. Sorry.
No worries. It's
Go
fine.
ahead.
So I guess what I guess I'm trying to say is if you talk to a real dyed in the wool atheist who doesn't, an atheist, right?
Uh-huh.
They wouldn't entertain the possibility that God could exist.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, they're saying
Yeah.
God does not exist.
But
They're making a positive claim God does not exist. An atheist says that, right?
I think, but if an atheist is sensible,
It's not
right,
possible.
you have to think it's possible, right? Because it's just conceivable. It's conceivability determines possibility, right? So I can conceive of a world without a God, but but you can also conceive of a world with a God, right? And definitely the resurrection is conceivable. Like what I said a while ago. I think we can conceive of the possibility of it now better than the people 2,000 years ago, right? Because we know that, like some resuscitation, or you trying, like when they try to save people who are dying, right, with that thing, that what do you call that? What they put on their chest, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so so the fact that those things can be done, right? I don't see why something like that can be done by God, right?
Well, somebody that was dead for 3 days, that might be a
Uh-huh.
little bit more hard to believe, but
Yeah. No, but again, it can be the case that again, that's still conceivably possible, right?
yeah, maybe he wasn't dead. Maybe he was just there for 3 days. He was just sitting there waiting for the rock to be rolled away.
If he was dead for a year or a month, right, that might be a different story.
Sure.
Right, but 3 days still, the level of its possibility is still, it's still there, right? It's possible that God could have, can do
Yeah.
something about that, right?
Well,
So sorry, I think we were. Go ahead.
the Jesus Seminar people,
Uh-huh.
you familiar with them?
Yes, yes, familiar. I heard about them. I read some stuff about them.
So one of them is, I think he's still alive, even maybe. I don't know. He was a former priest, a former monk, actually. What was his name? Anyway, he's one of the main authors of the Jesus Seminar movement, and he believed. It's a very fascinating debate he had with James White, because you have, it's not like Protestants debating on a doctrinal thing, and you have a common. But very, this scholar is very much probably in that camp of doubting the historicity of very much doubting the historicity of scriptures. What they were trying to do with the Jesus Seminar movement group was to find which ones are the most reliable, and that's the one we're going to go with, right? We're going to get rid of these other things, and they still maintain their Christianity. They're not like Ehrman, who's an agnostic. He maintains till his later years. He's still a Christian, but he didn't believe that Jesus resurrected from the dead. That Jesus' body was probably eaten by dogs, or something like that. I'm like, how do you make like what?
But I think that
what kind of Christian are you, though?
But the Jesus Seminar people, I don't think they are widely respected even among biblical scholars.
Is that true?
Yeah, they're not actually. As far as I can tell, right?
Okay.
I'm assuming even Bart Ehrman is probably not even a fan of the Jesus Seminar people, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
I
So
just didn't remember.
so I think we were talking for an hour and a half. So whoever will watch this up to this point, right? You guys are really interested in this kind of conversation, and I hope that you at least learned something here. By listening to us having this fun conversation. And again, we would like to thank you for joining us here at Symposia's Vodcast. Next week, we will have a very important guest. We're going to have Dr. Gabriel Catanos. We will have it on Tuesday because he's only available on Tuesday. 6 o'clock here, but it will be in California, but it will be about 8 o'clock for him in Chicago. Um, and um, and we're going to talk about Filipino American ministry because he's the newly appointed director of the Filipino American Ministry Initiative at Fuller Theological Seminary. That's the first of its kind. Okay, and I know we hardly talk about Filipino American stuff here on the vodcast, even though Laurence and I are both Filipinos. But I think it's a good thing to interview Gabriel Catanos, Dr. Gabriel Catanos. He received his Ph.D. in theology and ethics at Loyola University, Chicago, so a Catholic institution. And he's my fellow covenant pastor. He's pastoring a church at in where is that? Garden City in Illinois. Okay, so I hope to see you next week. We will be joined, hopefully, at least that's the plan. We will be joined by Dr. Alan Dionson, senior pastor of Charisma Life Church. Right, that's my former church. Okay, and the new pastor of that church is Dr. Alan Dionson. He received his Doctor of Ministry degree from Fuller Seminary, and that's the reason why I invited him to actually come and join us and talk to um, Gabriel Catanos. Okay, so I hope you guys will be excited about that. Yeah, so I'll see you guys next week. Have a blessed week. I'll see you next week. And then let me press finish here. You wanted to say something, Laurence? No?
No, I'm
Okay.
good.
Okay.
Have a great
There you
week,
go.
everyone.
Yeah. There you go. Finish.